The gate opened and the sunlight hit my face like it didn't recognize me, and the first thought I had was not, "Thank you," not, "I'm free," not even, "I made it." The first thought I had was, "I want to go back inside." My name is Raymond, and I'm 82 years old, and I was released after 50 years in prison, but when my feet touched the sidewalk outside that place, my hands started looking for a wall that wasn't there. People think the moment a man walks out is a clean moment, like a page turning. They imagine you stepping into a brand new life with a steady heart, like the world has been waiting politely for your return. They don't imagine you standing there with a thin plastic bag in your hand, squinting at the brightness, feeling your stomach tighten the way it does right before count, except there is no count. And that's the problem. Inside, everything had edges. You knew where you were supposed to stand. You knew when you were allowed to move. You learned to measure your life in announcements and whistles and the scrape of trays in the chow hall. My days were a rhythm you could tap with your knuckles. The loudspeaker, the keys, the line, the bench, the bunk, the yard, the phone, the shower, the lights. Even the bad parts were familiar, and familiarity can feel like safety when you've been hungry for anything that feels solid. I carried a little calendar for years, not the kind with pictures, just a plain one, like a receipt pad. Someone tore from somewhere. I taped it inside my locker, and I would cross off each day with the same pen until the ink ran out. Then I'd start again with whatever pen I could get my hands on. The crossed off squares looked like stitches. At first I crossed days off like I was cutting a rope, one link at a time. Later I crossed them off like I was making sure time still moved at all. 50 years is a long time to keep proving to yourself that tomorrow is real. Before prison, I was not an old man. I was a young man with a temper I called confidence and a pride I called dignity. I worked with my hands. I liked being right. I liked being the one who didn't back down. I had a wife then. I had a little boy who thought my shoulders were the safest place on earth. I had neighbors who waved and didn't lock their doors in the daytime. I had a car with a bench seat and a radio that cracked when you turned the knob. If you asked me back then what I was afraid of, I would have laughed. I thought fear was something other people carried. The choice that sent me away didn't feel like a fork in the road. It felt like a moment. An ordinary day with a little heat in it. A disagreement that should have ended with me walking out of a room, breathing, letting my pride cool off. Instead, I pushed. I spoke like I couldn't lose. I acted like consequences were for other men. I harmed someone. I can say that plainly now without reaching for excuses. I harmed someone, and I earned the years that came after. I stood in a courtroom in a borrowed shirt, listening to words I didn't understand at the time, not because they were complicated, but because I couldn't accept that my life was being taken apart in public. When the sentence came down, I felt my knees go weak, and I still remember the sound of my wife crying behind me, a sound that didn't fit in that room. The bus ride to the prison was quiet, except for chains and breathing. When the gate swallowed us, I thought I was entering a place that would be hard, and then someday I would leave it behind. I didn't know I was entering a place that would slowly teach my body and my mind how to live small. In the beginning, everything inside felt sharp. The first cell, I had smelled like bleach and old sweat. My bunk was thin, the mattress like a tired sponge. My cellmate didn't ask my name at first. He just watched me, like you watch a dog you don't know yet. The first night, I lay on my back staring at the underside of the bunk above me, listening to the building settle, men talking, someone coughing, someone laughing too loud. And I understood something I'd never understood in my whole life. The day was not mine anymore. Time belonged to the place. Count came like a tide, morning and evening, sometimes extra when something happened. Men would stand by their bunks, eyes forward, and the guards would walk past with clipboards. Chow hall was a moving river of bodies and trays. You learned quickly how to keep your eyes up without staring, how to keep your shoulders loose without looking weak, how to move with the flow without letting it carry you somewhere you didn't want to go. The yard was the only place the sky felt close enough to touch. But even there, you were always aware of lines you couldn't cross. I started my crossed-off calendar in those early years because I needed something that belonged to me, even if it was just a square I could mark. At first, I counted down to things like court appeals, like visits, like parole hearings that were so far away they might as well have been a story. I circled dates in that little calendar, the way a man in the desert circles water on a map. My son came to see me for the first time when he was still small enough to swing his legs under the visiting room table. My wife held his hand like she was afraid he would run. The visiting room smelled like vending machine coffee and floor cleaner. There were rules posted everywhere, and even then my pride tried to make it into an argument. But my wife's eyes were tired, and my boy looked at me like I was behind glass even when I wasn't. I tried to talk to him about school. I tried to make my voice light, like we were at home. He nodded the way children nod when they don't know what to do with an adult's sadness. As the years went on, visits thinned. My wife came less often. The drive was long. The money was tight. Life outside did not pause just because mine did. My son grew, and I saw it in snapshots that came in envelopes with my wife's handwriting. I would hold those pictures at the edge, careful not to smudge them, like the paper was sacred. Then my wife stopped sending pictures, and when she wrote, the letters got shorter, like the words hurt her throat. The prison phone became the closest thing I had to her voice. The phone was always a little greasy from so many hands. The plastic cord never sat right. You put in your number, you listened to the recorded warning, you waited for the line to connect, and your whole life outside had to fit into a few minutes that cost too much. Sometimes my wife would answer and talk to me like she was doing chores while she spoke. Sometimes she wouldn't answer at all, and I would hang up and pretend it didn't matter, then go back to my bunk and stare at my crossed-off calendar until the numbers blurred. The turning point for me came later than it should have, and it didn't come with fireworks. It came with a parole hearing that I had built up in my head, like a rescue. I had been inside for a long time by then. I had kept my record clean. I had taken the classes they offered. I had worked in the kitchen and in maintenance, pushing a mop down hallways that always smelled faintly of disinfectant. I had learned to keep my mouth shut when my old self wanted to speak. I thought I had earned something. I thought time itself was a kind of currency. They took me into a small room with a table and chairs, a camera in the corner, and a man behind a desk who looked at a file more than he looked at me. I wore the cleanest uniform I had. My hands were folded like I was in church. I spoke about responsibility. I spoke about regret. I tried to sound like the kind of man who deserved to go home. Then he asked me about the harm I caused, and I answered, and I could feel my voice shake, not because I was lying, but because the truth had weight. When it was over, I was led back out, and the officer walking me down the hall didn't soften his tone. He just said, "Denied." One word, flat as a door closing. Back in my unit, I sat on my bunk and stared at that little calendar. I had circled that hearing date so many times it looked bruised. For a long time, I didn't cross off the next day. I just sat there with a pen in my hand and felt something inside me crack, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, private way, like old wood giving out. I realized I had been living on the promise of soon, like it was a meal, and now I was starving. That night, I stood in line for the phone and called my wife. I didn't have a plan for what to say. When she answered, her voice sounded farther away than I remembered, like she was speaking from the other end of a long tunnel. I told her about the denial. There was a pause, and in that pause I heard the truth I'd been avoiding. She had been holding her life together with one hand while I waited for a system to hand me mine back. She said one sentence that I still hear sometimes when the lights go out. "Ray, I can't keep building my whole life around your waiting." She wasn't cruel. She wasn't yelling. She sounded tired in a way that made me ashamed. After that call, I went back to my bunk and crossed off the day anyway. Not because I felt hopeful, because I needed to accept that time was going to move, with or without my permission. Years went by after that. My wife stopped visiting. Then later I received a letter from someone else telling me she had passed. There's a particular kind of grief that happens in prison. It's grief with nowhere to go. You don't get to sit in a living room with family. You don't get to stand by a grave. You don't get to hold anyone's hand unless the hand belongs to a man in the bunk next to yours who doesn't know what to do with your pain. You go to chow with swollen eyes. You stand for count with your chest tight. You act normal because attention can be dangerous and because everyone else is carrying something too. I kept crossing off days. My calendar got replaced by another and another. Decades stitched together. I watched men come in young and leave older. I watched some men leave in a hurry with their property bag, a mix of excitement and terror in their eyes. I watched other men get wheeled out on gurneys, their faces turned toward the ceiling like they were trying to understand where they were going. Lockdowns happened sometimes for reasons we weren't told. You'd be on the verge of a shower or a phone call, and then the loudspeaker would crackle, and suddenly you were sealed into your cell. Meals slid through slots, days turning into each other. During one long lockdown, I lay on my bunk listening to the building breathe and realized how easily a man could vanish in there, and the world would keep moving anyway. That was a scare that didn't come from violence. It came from the simplicity of it. A life could end quietly, in a place built for waiting. By the time I was old enough to feel my bones complain in the cold, I stopped dreaming about walking out like a movie scene. I started dreaming about smaller things. Sitting at a table without a guard nearby. Touching grass that wasn't inside a fence. Buying an apple and eating it without anyone watching. Hearing a child laugh and not having to pretend it didn't hurt. My son and I did not have a smooth story. There were years when we didn't speak at all. Then one day, long after my wife was gone, he called me. I remember because I was in the day room and my name was called like it didn't belong to me anymore. I took the phone and my hands shook. He sounded like a man by then, not a boy. His voice carried years I hadn't been part of. He didn't talk about forgiveness like it was a ceremony. He talked about his life. He talked about his mother. He talked about how he used to tell people his father was dead because it was easier than explaining prison. Then he said something that didn't let me hide behind punishment anymore. I don't know you, but I don't want you to die in there. That line did something to me. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't absolution. It was a rope tossed over a wall, not to pull me out immediately, but to remind me there were still hands on the other end. After that, my steps toward change were small and almost boring, the kind of thing nobody makes speeches about. I signed up for the grief group when it was offered, not because I thought it would fix me, but because I was tired of carrying dead weight alone. I spoke to the chaplain sometimes, not about religion, as much as about what it means to live with what you did. I wrote letters I didn't always send. I started practicing saying the truth without dressing it up. I stopped telling myself I was only the worst thing I'd done, and I also stopped pretending the worst thing I'd done didn't define parts of my life. Both extremes were a way of avoiding the hard middle. I kept my calendar even when the squares got harder to see without my glasses. The crossed-off days became less about escape and more about witness. Proof that I was still here, still responsible for how I lived each day inside those walls. Then, after 50 years, I got the notice. It wasn't dramatic. It was paperwork. It was a date printed on a page that my brain didn't trust at first. I read it over and over like it might change. Men in my unit said, "Congratulations in a careful way, the way you speak around something fragile." A few looked away. Some were happy for me. Some were reminded of their own waiting. That's how it is in there. Your joy can be another man's ache. On release morning, I woke before the lights came on. My bunk creaked when I sat up, and I put my feet on the floor slowly like I was stepping onto new ground. I looked at the calendar one last time and crossed off the day before. The square was so full of ink, it was almost black. 50 years of marks. 50 years of proving time passed. Processing out took hours. You stand in lines like you always do, except this time the lines lead you away instead of back to your cell. Forms, signatures, the return of things that were never really yours. At one point, a staff member took my inmate ID card. The one I'd carried for so long, the edges had softened, and he cut it in half without looking at me. The sound of the scissors was small, but it landed heavy in my chest. That card had been my name for decades. Not Raymond. A number. A face on a faded photo. A barcode. And just like that, it was trash. They handed me a thin stack of papers, my property, and a little bit of money that felt like a joke after half a century. Then a door opened that I had walked through in my imagination so many times I thought I would know how it felt. That's where the hook in my story lives, right there at the edge. The outside air smelled like car exhaust and something sweet, maybe a tree, maybe somebody's perfume, and I didn't know what to do with it. The sky looked too big. The world sounded too fast. Cars moved past like they were in a hurry to get away from me. People walked holding small glowing screens, talking into the air, laughing at things I couldn't see. A man rolled past on a board with wheels under his feet like it was nothing. A woman said a word into her ear, and her ear answered her. I stood there feeling like I had been dropped into the future without a map. A volunteer from a program was there to take me to a halfway house. He was kind. He spoke slowly, like you speak to someone who's been through something. I nodded a lot because nodding was easier than explaining that my chest felt tight and my legs felt unsure. When he opened the car door for me, I paused. I had not sat in a car like that in decades. The seat was too soft. The door was too light. The window button felt like a trick. When the engine started, the sound was smooth and quiet, nothing like the old cars I remembered. The car moved, and my body tensed like I was bracing for a wrong turn inside a place where wrong turns mattered. We drove past stores that looked like bright boxes, past signs that changed pictures without paper, past neighborhoods I didn't recognize. I watched the streets and realized I could not read the world anymore. Inside, you learned one language and spoke it every day. Outside, everyone had moved on to a different one. The halfway house room had a bed, but it wasn't a bunk, and that alone made me uneasy. The sheets smelled like detergent, clean in a way that felt unfamiliar. The window was not barred. The door did not lock from the outside. I stood there for a long time with my bag in my hand, listening for an announcement that never came. That night, I lay in that bed and couldn't sleep. There was no count, no officer walking the tier, no keys, no distant televisions competing, just quiet. You might think quiet would feel like peace, but peace has its own weight when you don't trust it. In prison, the noise tells you where you are. Silence outside felt like falling. I got up and walked to the door. I opened it. The hallway was empty. I could keep walking. No one would stop me. That thought did not feel like freedom. It felt like standing at the edge of deep water when you spent your whole life on dry ground. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to breathe evenly. My mind did what it used to do in my cell during long nights. It made the familiar seem like the only thing that could hold me. I pictured my old bunk. I pictured the narrow space that had held my life in place. I pictured the routine that told me who I was every hour. I pictured the yard at a certain time of day, the same patch of sky framed by fence. I pictured the chow hall line, the tray in my hands, the taste of coffee that was never strong enough. I pictured the calendar with its crossed off squares. I pictured safety, and it looked like a cage. That is the part nobody wants to hear, that a man can miss the place that punished him, that a cell can start to feel like a home, not because it was good, but because it was known. The next morning, I tried to do something simple. I walked to a corner store with money in my pocket. The doors opened by themselves when I got close, and I flinched like the building had noticed me. Inside, there were too many choices. A whole wall of cereal. Rows of drinks in colors that didn't exist when I went in. People moved around me like they belonged there. I stood in one aisle too long, holding a box, trying to understand if I was allowed to just take it to the front. Nobody watched me. Nobody barked an order. That, too, made my stomach twist. When I got back to my room, I sat down and wrote on a piece of paper because I didn't have my calendar anymore. I drew a little square and crossed it off. It was a childish thing, maybe, but my hand needed it. My mind needed a marker, something that said, "This day happened, and you survived it." I called my son from a phone that didn't have a cord, and when he answered, I didn't try to sound strong. I told him the truth, plain and small. I told him I felt afraid. I told him part of me wanted to go back because I knew how to live there. There was a long pause, and then he said quietly, like he was choosing his words, that he could pick me up that weekend and we could sit somewhere and just talk. No big plans, no pressure. He didn't promise me a new life. He offered me a chair. That was how the fear began to loosen, not with a celebration, not with a grand moment, but with a small, human thing. A man offering another man a place to sit. Over the next weeks, I learned that freedom is not a door you walk through once. It's a muscle. It shakes at first, it cramps, it hurts in ways you don't expect. In prison, you can say, "I have no choice," and that sentence can numb you. Outside, you have choices again, even small ones, and that can feel like standing in a storm without shelter. I learned to ask for help without feeling like I was begging. I learned how to use a bus pass. I learned how to stand at a crosswalk and trust the light. I learned that people outside don't line up the same way, and they don't speak the same way. And sometimes they look right through you, and sometimes they look at you with curiosity that feels like a bruise. I learned to keep moving anyway. I also learned something harder, that my punishment ended on paper, but my responsibility didn't. I can't give those 50 years back to the person I harmed. I can't rewind my son's childhood. I can't hand my wife back her life. Freedom didn't erase any of that. Freedom just removed the walls so I couldn't hide behind them. That's what I mean when I say I wanted to go back. I didn't want chains. I didn't want a number. I didn't want the noise and the rules and the cold meals. I wanted the comfort of being told what I was and where I belonged. I wanted the kind of life where the boundaries were drawn for me, because then I wouldn't have to face the terrifying truth that the rest of my life is mine to carry, and I have to decide what kind of man carries it. If you've never been locked up, you might not understand how a cage can start to feel familiar, how the mind can confuse routine with protection. But you don't need prison bars for that to happen. People build small cages out of habits every day, out of fear of change, out of shame, out of a job they hate but know, out of a relationship that hurts but is predictable, out of silence because speaking feels risky. Familiar can feel like safety when you're tired, and that's how a person stays stuck for years without realizing it. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you because I stood on the other side of a gate after half a century and realized the world had moved on without me, and my own mind tried to pull me back toward what I knew, even though what I knew had taken everything from me. I still sometimes wake up early, heart thumping, listening for keys that aren't coming. I still sometimes draw a little square on a piece of paper and cross it off, just to calm the part of me that spent decades surviving one day at a time. And then I look out at the street, at people walking where they choose, and I remind myself, gently, that unfamiliar is not the same as dangerous, and known is not the same as safe. So if there is a door in your life you keep avoiding, because the room on the other side feels too big, I want you to understand something from a man who spent 50 years in a place with very small rooms. The world will not wait. Time will not soften just because you're afraid, but you can learn to stand in the open. You can learn to breathe without bars. You can learn, one crossed off day at a time, that freedom feels strange before it feels like yours. Stay free in the ways that matter. Stay honest about the cages you're calling home. And if your heart tries to drag you back to what's familiar just because it's familiar, remember my first step outside, my hands reaching for a wall that wasn't there, and choose the open air anyway.